Welcome to the Fully Mindful podcast. I'm your host, Melissa. I designed this podcast for you. I'm so happy you're here. We are talking about what it means to live with more intention, creativity, and authenticity so we can make aligned connections. I'm a neurodivergent lawyer turned coach who found the healing power of breathwork and the powerful impact of mindfulness as we navigate this wild and beautiful ride of life. Here at the Fully Mindful, we dive deep with inspiring guests, share solo mini-sodes that are packed with tools you can apply immediately, and I mix it up a bit with tangents and sidebars where my friend and host of the New World Normal podcast, Debbie Harrell, joins us for some down-to-earth, sometimes random, but always meaningful conversations. If you're ready to breathe, reflect, and grow, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful. All right, and welcome everybody. This is Melissa. I'm here on the Fully Mindful, and I'm happy to welcome Dr. Hila Pazner to the podcast. Dr. Pazner is a licensed psychologist based in Portland, Oregon. She's someone who brings depth to her work, having studied at my alma mater, UC Berkeley, and later teaching graduate students in school psychology program. She's spent years working in schools as a school psychologist in the Bay Area, helping children and families navigate the ups and downs of learning and development. Now she combines that experience in her private practice, Mind Map Psychoeducational Services, where she specializes in assessments and support for kids with learning differences such as ADHD, autism, and also social emotional challenges. Dr. Pazner, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about what initially drew you into the field of psychology and working specifically with children and adolescents?
Sure, yeah. So when I was growing up, my experiences in schools was very formative for me and instrumental in setting the direction of my life. And I just had a great experience in school and really enjoyed the teachers that I had and was involved in extracurricular activities. And it was a big part of my identity. So for me, it was important to try and give every kid the best shot at maximizing their potential in the school framework. I've also always been interested in psychology, so I decided to complete my undergraduate studies at UCLA in psychology. I found the lectures fascinating and just knew that I wanted to work in the field of psychology. And I particularly like working with kids and had a lot of background working with kids growing up. So for me, school psychology and then more generally child psychology felt like a really natural fit.
Yeah. And so then you went and did your graduate work up at Berkeley. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And it seems like you eventually did some work in the Bay Area where Berkeley is located. That must have been pretty informative. It's a pretty diverse population.
It was. Yeah. I was in San Francisco and then also in schools that were affluent and schools that were less affluent too. So I felt like I got experiences working with a wide range of different students and then different types of disabilities. It was a great experience. I just loved working in schools, both in elementary school settings and then also at the high school setting, even a bit with preschoolers.
I'm wondering if you have any takeaways in terms of how the educational system works and how it doesn't work to serve different populations of kids who have different learning abilities.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I would say that I think sometimes schools are well-resourced, a lot of resources that they can provide children, and other times they don't. So it's a bit harder. I think that it's helpful when there's a school psychologist and then the numbers also are less so that there aren't as many students that the school psychologist needs to serve. Like if the ratio is smaller, I would say that's helpful. I think that's a big part of it, that sometimes there just aren't enough resources. Now that there's so many kids who have learning disabilities and ADHD and who have IEPs, that's sometimes a percentage as high as 20 or even 25%, which is a really, really large number.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is, unlike when I was growing up, where kids who had different learning abilities or disabilities, depending on how you want to look at it, kids like me were generally, I grew up with ADHD myself, and we were generally segregated into different classrooms, generally
Mhm.
one big classroom, right? So it was like all the kids who had different abilities or learning disabilities were all grouped together, which was really interesting, right?
Mhm.
Some teacher would have to be dealing with kids who had developmental disabilities, and then kids who had autism and D or social emotional difficulties. They were all
Mhm.
grouped in one classroom. I was fortunate enough, my mother was able to keep me in the regular classroom. And that's now the norm, right? To keep kids integrated into the regular classrooms, which causes other difficulties for teachers.
Mhm.
Undoubtedly, that's also a challenge as well, but probably better all the kids to learn how to interact with one another, and certainly much better for the kids with learning differences, I think, is what has been found. Is
Mhm.
that right?
Yeah, so there's really a push to mainstream
Mm-hmm.
kids to have them with other children in the general education setting
Right.
as much as possible, even for kids who would benefit from being in a special education classroom, to at least have maybe some of the non-academic classes be with other kids in the general education setting. And in general, too, like we want kids to be in what's called like the least restrictive setting or least restrictive environment.
Right.
So it's important that schools and just adults working with children in the school setting try different interventions and first try them in the general education classroom. And then if those interventions aren't working, then maybe consider placing a child in a mild moderate classroom, for example, but only after we've really exhausted just other types of supports and interventions first.
Right. And again, that makes sense. It seems to be, if you can do it in the least restrictive setting, then that tends to be more helpful for the
Mhm.
child. So I think that's great. I do think it's interesting, kind of going back to that issue of resources. I know, for instance, my
Mhm.
child, we're here in Portland as well. And growing up in elementary school and in middle school, I mean, I think there was like one child psychologist for the entire school,
Mhm.
maybe.
Mhm.
And, I can't imagine. And they came in like once a week or something. I remember it being very minimal. I know it's
Uh,
better and they have more support through counselors and other
mhm.
resources in the high school, but it can be really challenging because it seems to me there are more and more psychological challenges that these kids are managing, whether or not they have learning differences. I mean, just talking just across the board psychological challenges with everything that
Mhm.
kids are facing
Mhm.
these days. And there are very few resources by and large,
Mhm.
unless you just happen to be fortunate enough to live in a public school district that's really well funded.
Really depends too on the state and the district and the city. So there's just so many different variables that can affect that.
Yeah, it can be really challenging. So, and you've worked in both the educational system as well as now you work in a clinical setting. You have your own practice,
Mhm.
working with individual kids and families. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of the differences with that and how you're able to help kids and families in your current practice?
Sure, yeah. So my current practice focuses on assessments.
Mhm.
So specifically like psychoeducational assessments and neuropsych assessments. So families come to me typically because their child is struggling and they might not really be sure why. So maybe the child has like a learning disability or autism or
Mhm.
ADHD or some other type of like diagnosis or
Mhm.
disorder. And then what I do is I meet with the family. I really try to understand like why is it that the child isn't thriving in the school setting. So I complete like a comprehensive assessment. I do like different types of testing. I review records. I speak with parents and teachers, of course, and then I come up with a plan and then potentially also a diagnosis to try to understand why that child has had a hard time and hasn't succeeded in the school setting. And then I come up with a plan about what we could do to ensure that child's success moving forward. A big difference, I think, between like my own practice and then working in the school setting is that with my own practice, I could give as many assessments really as I want to a child. And in the school setting, you're just more limited with time and resources. So
Mhm.
I think it's just harder to delve deeply into specific case in the school setting.
Are there different sorts of assessments that are available to you in the private setting as well?
I think it depends on the school. I worked at San Francisco Unified, and we had access to a ton of different types of assessments. That district is pretty well resourced. I wouldn't say compared to that district that I had fewer resources that I had access to, but there were definitely some districts where now I actually have more access to certain assessments in my practice compared to those districts. So I think it depends.
Yeah. I'm curious, are you satisfied with the current assessments that you have available to you? And the reason I ask this, recently I had to look at some assessments, and they weren't school assessments. They were assessing my own ADHD without going into, they weren't I guess maybe the more typical assessments that I had taken when I was younger. They were just looking at symptoms, and they seemed very antiquated, such as looking at whether I had the hyperactivity component. They were asking whether or not I had trouble sitting down in my chair and if I had to stand up and move around a lot. I just thought, oh, that seems very antiquated. Wondering if the assessments that you have access to are more up to date and accurately, at least in your clinical opinion, accurately reflect whether it's ADHD or autism or some other diagnosis, reflect what you're seeing out there in the community, what you're seeing in kids.
I feel like for the most part they do, especially like if we're thinking about ADHD, like the rating scales that I give don't just focus on like the hyperactivity symptoms related to ADHD or like impulsivity. They'll focus also on inattentive subtypes and inattentive symptoms. So at least with that respect, I feel like they're pretty good. I would say sometimes with autism, I feel like there's room for improvement. Like I feel like especially some of the autism rating scales tend to maybe capture kids with like autism where there are also like cognitive impairments associated with the autism and maybe like lower functioning, and it's harder to caption those kids with higher functioning autism. In general, I would say that I'm pretty satisfied with the assessments that I have available to me. What's really important for me when I work with kids is that I gather many different types of data and many different types of data points. I do the actual testing in my office with the child I'm working with, but I also make sure to talk with the parents and the teachers. I review records for patterns of behavior from previous school years, any other testing available, any testing data that's available, my observations also in the room with the child. So I try to gather a lot of different data when I come up with a diagnosis and make my recommendations.
And I think that's really important. I remember having to go through an assessment, it was still quite some time ago, as an adult, and was really struck by how thorough the assessment was. It was hours and hours that I spent with a psychologist, and was really impressed at how specific it was, determining where, at least for me, what my deficits were, where my strengths were, where I could use support. And it was extremely helpful. And I think that's important for parents also to understand, is you're not just going to get a diagnosis for your kid. You're probably also, especially if they work with someone like you're going to get a plan. Like this is where your kiddo needs some supports, and where you can really, as a parent, also help support your kid. It's not just like, oh, you're doomed. Here's a diagnosis, take some medications, bye. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a question I get all the time from parents. Like, are we just going to get a diagnosis? Or are we going to get a plan afterwards? And I find that to be actually the most important part of the assessment, right? That's the reason you're doing that comprehensive battery, is to come up with a plan and to learn about the child's strengths also, so that you can come up with interventions that build on that child's strengths and that utilize those strengths as well. So yeah, I find that really important. And sometimes parents also, they're worried about the stigma associated with a diagnosis, and is my child going to be labeled? What I say to those parents is that really the diagnosis is there to just help us like understand what interventions are going to be best for your child and are evidence-based. So that's really what the purpose is.
Yeah, and I get it. As somebody who's had a diagnosis and did not come out, as it were, with that diagnosis well into adulthood, I understand it because there was a stigma associated with it. I think more and more, and hopefully will continue to be more and more, less of a stigma. And as we understand that this is just really a different way of thinking, of learning,
Mm-hmm.
a neurological difference many times with people. And in any event, it's just people are just wired differently and think differently.
Mm-hmm.
And there are strengths that go along with these different
Mm-hmm.
diagnoses, as well as maybe deficits or difficulties, but that's only because there are certain expectations in the kind of culture that we live.
Mm-hmm.
So they might not be deficits if we were living in a different sort of a culture, right? They might be
That's
considered
true.
strengths. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a way of looking at things. So I appreciate that. That's an important part of how you're working with these families. One of the things that I really wanted to talk with you and have an interest in is ADHD in particular has often been thought or traditionally been thought of as more common in boys, even still to this day, seems to
Mm-hmm.
be more commonly thought of as a boy condition.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, we know that it is also something that girls can have and women can have, and it's often still to this day underdiagnosed. Do you have a sense of, or could you explain some of the reasons why that might still be the case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of reasons. The first reason is that girls on average tend to display more inattentive symptoms compared to boys and tend to have more of like the inattentive subtype of ADHD. So these types of symptoms are largely overlooked in the classroom setting. They're less disruptive. There are less like behavioral challenges associated with them. Kids who are hyperactive and impulsive, those are types of behaviors that teachers would find maybe annoying and just making it harder for them to teach. So that's one major reason that I would say why ADHD is often overlooked with girls. Another one too is that with girls, there tend to be a lot of symptoms like that related to anxiety and depression. So some mood disorders tend to be comorbid with ADHD in girls. And then what happens is that the clinician working with the girl could potentially like attribute the challenges that the girl is having to be due to maybe anxiety or due to depression, because people with anxiety and people with depression also tend to be inattentive, tend to be like restless. So they may be attributing that the concerns that the girl is having to be only due to anxiety and depression. That could be one reason. And that's an idea in psychology called diagnostic overshadowing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. There's also just gender-based bias, I would say. There was even actually a study done where teachers and parents had to read different vignettes about different kids. And then the kids had different names, either names typically given to boys or names typically given to girls. What they found is that depending on what name the child had, that was associated with whether the teachers and the parents were likely to then recommend services or recommend further testing. They changed the names of the, like, whether it was a boy and a girl, but kept the content of the vignette the same. So there's some gender bias.
That's fascinating. So if the vignette, everything else was the same, but
Mhm.
it's John or Maria, right?
Mhm.
And
Exactly.
if it were John, they were more likely to recommend services than.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was a study that was done that shows that there is some just gender-based bias.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that I would say too is that just in general, like boys tend to be more at risk for pretty much all neurodevelopment diagnoses and disorders during the first decade of life. So, for example, Tourette's, learning disabilities, tics, autism.
Mm-hmm.
And then girls tend to be more at risk for like mood and anxiety disorders during the second decade of life. So that could explain also just partially why about just many more boys are diagnosed with ADHD compared to girls. And the ratio of females to males is about 2 to 3 to 1.
That's interesting. I also wonder what your opinion is on this issue of masking. If
Mm-hmm.
you become really good at masking your symptoms, if you're an inattentive type, maybe you might be pretty good at masking it, and maybe just people in general can't see it well enough. Like you said, you're less likely to be annoying or distracting
Mhm.
in the classroom, and you've learned how to just stay under the radar and mask your symptoms, not ask for
Mhm.
help. And
Mhm.
so people don't know that you're really having issues, that you're really struggling, that these kids might actually be really having problems because they're not articulating it, because they don't want to call
Mhm.
attention to themselves. Could that have something to do with it?
Yeah, definitely. So that's something actually that we know is kind of more common with girls with ADHD is that they do tend to just engage in these types of compensatory behaviors.
Mm,
So maybe they're compensating by spending a ton of time on their homework every night. So maybe like twice as much
right,
as neurotypical girls. They may then be producing the work and turning it in, and the work might even be quite good, but then the teachers don't see just what it took to get them to turn in that assignment and just how
right.
hard that they had to work to be able to just complete different tasks.
Right. They're still getting really good grades and they're turning in good work. And so the
Right.
teachers have no idea that it took them 6 hours to do something that maybe a neurotypical kid, it would have
Mhm.
taken an hour to do. And
Exactly.
not as much frustration or difficulty
Exactly.
mentally
Yeah.
or
Right,
psychologically.
right. So that's why when just assessing girls with ADHD, like it's important, or girls that maybe you suspect have ADHD, it's
Mhm.
important to ask those types of questions. Like, can you tell me a little bit more about like what the experience is of your daughter completing homework, and like, are they spending a lot of time on their work, and just to better understand if they're compensating in any way. And then what happens is too is that there is often like a transition point where maybe like a person was able to compensate, and then there's a certain point where they can't compensate anymore because the
Right.
demands are too high. And then at that point, too, is maybe just when things begin to fall apart. So, like middle school is a
Hmm.
time that this often happens when children have a lot of different classes, a lot of teachers. They need to be pretty organized and keeping track of different assignments. School begins to be a little harder, too. So, it's important to pay attention to those transitional periods as well.
And I could see, unfortunately, when girls start to exhibit some difficulties at that time period, that it might get chalked up as, oh, well, it's just hormones, which it
Mm-hmm.
could be partially, right? And, hormones do bear on how we experience the world, but it could also be something else.
That's true.
Interesting. So, if a parent is suspecting that their daughter might be having ADHD or might be struggling with that, where do they start? Do they just obviously people can contact you if they're in the greater Portland area, but if they're not, they're, somewhere else in the country, what's a good place to start?
Let's take a quick break.
Hey there, fully mindful listeners. Did you know that I host in-person breathwork sessions every quarter in Portland at Kiva's beautiful sanctuary in Northwest Portland and at Flow Yoga in Hood River? Each session is perfectly timed with the seasons, offering powerful themes like peace and renewal, awaken and align, fire and flow, gather and ground, and inner hearth. Together, we'll dive deep into the conscious connected breathwork to explore, release, and transform. Can't make it in person? No worries. I also host online breathwork sessions every third Thursday of the month, except during holiday months, with 96-hour replays. So wherever you are, you can still join in. Visit thefullymindful.com for all the details. Let's breathe together.
I would say it's a good place to start to, first of all, talk to your child's teacher, just
Mm-hmm.
to learn, or teachers, just to learn about like what they're noticing, if they're observing any challenges, if your daughter is maybe daydreaming in class. I would also talk to my child's pediatrician and just let
Mm-hmm.
them know about what some of the concerns are. And then that pediatrician can also potentially refer the family to a psychologist in the area or a clinician who can help just further assess. I would, yeah, I mean, some pediatricians will often also do their own assessments for ADHD. So what that typically looks like is like a brief conversation with the family and with the child, and then also giving Vanderbilt forms, which are like rating scales that look at ADHD symptoms. And then they ask both the teacher and then the parents to complete those forms. And then they can also diagnose ADHD based off of that information and those rating scales. I think what's more helpful is really to have a more comprehensive assessment where you're really doing additional testing, and you're also just looking at potential other diagnoses also that could be affecting the child, like underlying learning disabilities, anxiety, depression. Those are some examples.
Right. And I mean, it's great to start with the pediatrician, but like you said, it would be fairly limited what they would be able to do. They might be able to diagnose, but they're not going to come with a comprehensive plan, figuring out exactly what their deficits are. For instance, when I was talking about what my deficits were, I learned that I can't remember exactly what it's called. You would know. It was like an auditory to written deficit. I had difficulty with auditory processing. I had no problem listening. I could listen and process just fine, but then putting it to notes in that moment, that was the difficulty. I was much better off just listening to, let's say, a lecture or a professor or teacher saying something and processing it in that moment, and not taking notes and then taking the notes later or having somebody else take notes for me. If I tried to take notes, I'd get lost, right? There was some neurologically, just something would happen. But learning that was really helpful for me because number one, I recognized that there was not something, wrong with me. Like my brain didn't work this way. And so therefore there were supports that I could obtain and learn the material just as well as anyone else. I just needed these different supports. And so that's the kind of thing that you can learn when you get properly assessed. Whereas if you just go to your pediatrician, you might just get like, oh, here's your diagnosis and maybe a prescription for a medication if that's the route that you decide to take, right?
Right. In a situation like that, it would be helpful to just work with someone who can provide a plan and then to just make any types of differential types of diagnoses as well. I think is really critical.
And speaking of medication, it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for every person. Is that right?
Yeah. So what we know about ADHD is that both medication and behavioral supports, those two things together are going to be the most effective. Medication can really help with improving sustained attention and reducing hyperactivity and impulsivity. But medication in itself doesn't teach skills, right? So while it may make you more amenable to learning and easier for you to complete tasks, it's really valuable to also work with someone who can teach you executive functioning skills, how to plan, stay organized, manage your time, and use different tools that can help you get there.
Yeah, and yet another reason why those more comprehensive assessments are helpful, right? Because then whomever the child or the family works with can see where the child needs the support, where the child needs to learn different skills, and how best to teach that skill to the child.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we were talking about some of the underdiagnoses of girls and ADHD. What impact have you seen that underdiagnosis has? So like what happens to these girls who don't get diagnosed and somehow, muddle through their way through school or not? What are some of the impacts on them for not being diagnosed?
So I think part of it is just their self-concept and their self-esteem can be really harmed. They're struggling and they might not know why. There might not be a name to it. And so they might not have this self-understanding, which I think is part of it. What we see is that could actually lead also to a lot of anxiety related to learning. So that can be part of the clinical picture too. There was an interesting and really important study conducted by Stephen Hinshaw and his colleagues at UC Berkeley. That was like a longitudinal study, and it tracked girls with ADHD and then across their lifespan over a couple of decades. And what it actually found is that girls with ADHD, and specifically the combined type of ADHD, were twice as likely to engage in different types of self-harm behavior. So for example, cutting, and then even like make attempts to end their life. So some suicide attempts to compare to other neurotypical girls, and then compared also to boys with ADHD. So those can be some kind of like long-lasting effects too of maybe not being like diagnosed with ADHD potentially, or being diagnosed with ADHD, but also not receiving like appropriate treatment or sufficient treatment.
Right. I mean, those can be pretty significant consequences for girls and then later the women that they grow into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Conversely, how does treatment and diagnosis make a difference, both for girls and the women they become? I mean, can you share some examples of how that has been life-changing?
So I think part of it is just, again, like what I was mentioning earlier, like understanding what it is that's going on, and that their brain is maybe working a little bit differently, but that there are also lots of people who are successful with ADHD and that they can be successful as well. And then specifically like learning what works for them, learning different types of accommodations that can help them down the line, just ways to manage different types of like things that they need to do for work or for school, for example, also. So that's another part of it, I would say.
Yeah, it seems like it can be pretty informative and pretty like life-changing to have that assessment and to have that self-knowledge and get the supports that you need, specifically ADHD for girls, but then, just kind of looking more broadly, any of these diagnoses that we've been talking about, autism or social emotional difficulties or learning disabilities. It just is amazing what kind of life a person can have just by getting the supports that they need, rather than muddling through life, just sort of thinking that this is your lot in life, right? This is all you have, right? You can have so much more, and so much is available now. And we know so much now in the state of science and school psychology. There's so much available for these kids, and they don't have to suffer anymore. And there doesn't have to be a stigma anymore. I think that's a hopeful message. So kind of taking a broader reflection here, you've also had some experience teaching in the field of psychology, right? And some teaching. How do you see the field of school psychology evolving, especially when it comes to supporting kids with neurodivergent needs?
So I think there's been a push for strength-based assessments. So I think that's been one area, mostly strength-based assessments, affirming individuals who are neurodiverse. And just thinking of people who are just that this is just diversity, I think. And that, so I think that's part of it too. And just having it be less of a deficit model and focusing on the deficits as well.
I think it would be great if we could change the DSM-5 to maybe not call it attention deficit disorder. That would be a great start. I've never thought of it as a deficit, because I actually think it's an overload, or at least that's how I've experienced it. And a lot of neurodivergent folks I've talked to, that's how they experience it as well, is an overload of attention and maybe not being focused on any one thing because there's so much happening all at once. So I've always thought that was interesting, although it is a huge improvement from back when I was initially diagnosed. It was called minimal brain dysfunction, which is even worse. So I'm glad it's changed to ADHD, but I do think that there probably is maybe something that is a little bit more accurate to describe it. Like you said, it's really a neurodivergence. It's a diversity in a way of thinking, in a way of being. And I'm very happy to hear that is evolving, that they're looking at it from a framework of diversity and strength rather than deficit. That's a very hopeful message as well.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. And as someone who is also, I'm a coach in addition to practicing law, and in the field of coaching, I mean, that is what we look at, right? We look at strengths, we look at the future, we look at how do we continue to move forward? So that's an amazing positive development in the field of psychology. Well, outside of your amazing professional world, which is very impressive, what sorts of things do you enjoy doing? What fills you up? What keeps you energized when you're not helping all these kids and families?
Well, I have two young boys. So I have boy who is 9 months old, and then one that is almost 3.5. They keep me busy. I love spending time with them. So that's a really big part of my life, especially now when they're really young. I like to spend time with them and my husband and exploring Portland because we're pretty new to Portland. We've only been here for a couple of years. I enjoy running, jogging, hiking, and reading.
Yeah, it sounds like you're able to keep, at least from the over here on this side of the screen, a healthy balance between your work and academic endeavors as well as your family and self-care endeavors. You think that's pretty accurate?
I think that mostly it feels like my life is pretty well balanced, but I think there's always ups and downs. There's times where I feel like I need to prioritize work, and then there are other times where I need to prioritize family life. So it goes up and down too.
But that's a healthy message too, right? It can't always be perfect, right? We have to allow for a little give, a little take. So what's next for you? Anything on the horizon, work-wise, family-wise, anything-wise?
No, I feel like I'm in a good place right now just to continue with the private assessments that I'm doing, my work over at the children's clinic also, which I'm enjoying. That feels to me like a nice balance. And then, yeah, I feel like at this point, that feels to me like a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. Well, if people wanted to find out more about your practice, or if perhaps they're in the greater Portland area and they have questions about their kid and getting assessed, how might they find you?
So they can look me up. My website is mindmaptesting.com. They can send me an email. They can fill out a form on my website. They could schedule a free consult through my website too. And I'd be happy to chat more with them.
Oh, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. And it was great to talk with you. Very informative and very helpful. And I can't wait for folks to be able to listen to this. And maybe in a couple of years, we'll have you come back and talk about how your practice has evolved and what you're up to next.
Sounds great. Thanks again. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me on the Fully Mindful podcast. If you got value from this episode, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who loves this content too. Remember, small moments of mindfulness can lead to big changes in your day-to-day life. Until next time, take a deep breath, stay present, and tap into your own mindfulness. I'll see you next week.